Cavalry surge across the West African savanna. 20,000 warriors move as one, encircling cities, raising earthen walls meters thick, sealing territory larger than many modern states. The commands come from a woman. She terrified kings across the Sahara. Yet outside Africa, her name is almost unknown. If Alexander is remembered as great, if Caesar and Napoleon dominate world history, why has Amina of Zazzau vanished? This is not a personal tale, but a record of African power erased, women's authority obscured, and non-European empires written out of memory. The middle of the 16th century was an age of acceleration. Between 1530 and 1560, political power across the world was being reorganized through violence, administration, and scale. Old structures collapsed. New systems hardened. This was not a transitional moment. It was a reordering. In Europe, kingdoms were emerging from the medieval fragmentation that had defined the previous centuries. Central authority expanded at the expense of local lords. Standing armies replaced feudal levies. Overseas expansion had begun to redraw the world map, driven by maritime technology and extraction. Europe was not yet dominant everywhere, but it was becoming aggressive, outward-facing, and increasingly centralized. At the same time, the Ottoman Empire stood at its height. It controlled the eastern Mediterranean, dominated the Islamic heartlands, and regulated trade routes linking Europe, Asia, and Africa. Its military institutions were refined, its bureaucracy disciplined, and its political legitimacy reinforced through religion and conquest. The Ottoman state represented what a mature empire looked like in this era. Across the Atlantic, the Inca world had already been shattered. Spanish conquest dismantled a complex imperial system through warfare, disease, and exploitation. This collapse demonstrated a central truth of the century. No civilization was immune to disruption, regardless of its sophistication. Africa was not isolated from these transformations. West Africa, in particular, was deeply integrated into long-distance networks of trade, scholarship, and power. Gold from the southern forests, salt from the Sahara, horses from the Sahel, and intellectual traditions from the Islamic world circulated through its cities. Wealth moved along established corridors. Authority followed those routes. At the center of this system stood the Hausa city-states. 7 major polities dominated the region: Kano, Katsina, Zazzau, Gobir, Rano, Dora, and Bam. These were not villages or tribal settlements. They were fortified urban centers with administrative hierarchies, standing armies, and commercial institutions. Each controlled territory. Together, they governed access between North Africa and the forest zones of the south. Among them, Zazzau held a uniquely strategic position. It sat at the convergence of multiple economic worlds. To the north lay the salt routes of the Sahara. To the south stretched forest regions producing kola nuts, ivory, and captives. To the east came horses from the Lake Chad basin. To the west flowed gold. Zazzau was not simply connected to these routes. It regulated them. The city itself reflected this function. Massive earthen walls enclosed its core, reinforced by watchtowers and controlled gates. Markets attracted merchants from across West Africa. Islamic scholars staffed courts and schools, providing legal and administrative legitimacy. Zazzau was designed for endurance, surveillance, and control. This was not a peripheral world waiting to be discovered. It was a competitive, strategic environment already shaped by empire. And it was into this world that Amina was born. Amina was born around 1533 into the ruling house of Zazzau, at a time when power in the Hausa world was neither symbolic nor distant. Authority was exercised openly, enforced through armies, and negotiated through trade and religion. From childhood, she lived inside a court where decisions altered borders and campaigns reshaped lives. Power was not explained to her. It was visible. Her father, King Nikatau, ruled as a warrior and an expansionist. His authority rested on military success, territorial growth, and the ability to extract tribute from subordinate communities. Campaigns were frequent, not exceptional. Victories confirmed legitimacy. Failure invited challenge. Under his reign, Zazzau extended its reach, securing routes that fed its markets and filled its treasuries. For Amina, conquest was not legend. It was governance. Her mother, Bakwa Turunku, represented another form of authority. She operated within the court as a political force, shaping succession, alliances, and internal balance. Her influence did not depend on the battlefield, but on networks of loyalty and control over access to the ruler. In Zazzau, women of status could own property, command retainers, and intervene in state affairs. Female rule was uncommon, but it was not unthinkable. Memory preserved examples, and precedent mattered. This environment defined Amina's early education. She was trained to observe before she was trained to act. Court life taught her how power was distributed, how it was concealed, and how it was defended. She witnessed negotiations with merchants whose caravans sustained the state, with Islamic scholars who legitimized authority, and with military commanders who enforced it. She learned protocol, religious literacy, and the rhythms of governance. The turning point came in the year 1549, when King Nikatau died. His death disrupted the equilibrium of the court and exposed the mechanisms of succession. Authority did not pass smoothly by tradition alone. It had to be secured. In this moment, Bakwa Turunku moved decisively, consolidating influence and guiding the transition of power. She did not rule openly, but her presence shaped outcomes. For Amina, this rupture marked a shift. She ceased to be merely a royal daughter. She became a figure of potential. Her education intensified, no longer limited to observation. She was brought closer to decision-making, exposed to strategy, and allowed to learn from commanders rather than simply watch them. What had been proximity to power became preparation for it. This process was deliberate. Amina was not presented as a chosen figure or symbol. She was being constructed through discipline, exposure, and expectation. Her environment did not promise her rule. It tested her capacity. By the end of her adolescence, she understood a central truth of her world. Authority was not inherited intact. It was assembled, defended, and constantly contested. Amina's next decision placed her in direct conflict with expectation. Royal daughters in Zazzau were trained for alliance, ritual visibility, and marriage into power. Their education prepared them to stabilize the state through kinship, not to command it through force. Amina rejected that framework. She did not ask for exemption. She demanded transformation. Her request was precise. She sought military training, not ceremonial refinement. This was not defiance for its own sake. It was calculation. In a political system where authority ultimately rested on the capacity to coerce, symbolic power was insufficient. Amina understood that survival depended on competence in war. Her training began with cavalry. She learned to ride at speed, to control a horse under pressure, and to fight from the saddle in formation. Cavalry was the decisive arm of Hausa warfare, demanding coordination, endurance, and discipline. She mastered sword and spear, learning how distance and momentum determined outcomes. Archery followed, not as ornament, but as battlefield utility. Beyond individual skill, She was trained in systems of war. She studied siegecraft, the construction and reduction of fortified towns, and the logic of encirclement. She learned to read terrain, to identify supply routes, and to calculate how long an army could remain in the field. Campaigns were not treated as moments of chaos, but as logistical problems to be solved. Her education extended beyond local tradition. Zazzau existed within a wider Islamic military world, and ideas circulated through scholars, traders, and mercenaries. Amina was exposed to concepts associated with Byzantine fortification, Mamluk elite cavalry, and Ottoman command structures. These were not copied wholesale. They were adapted to local conditions, integrated with West African practices rather than replacing them. Leadership was her most demanding lesson. To command men as a woman required more than skill. It required legitimacy constructed through performance. Amina learned to speak little and act decisively. Orders were clear, punishments predictable, and rewards public. She cultivated consistency, knowing that uncertainty eroded authority faster than brutality. Presence mattered. She learned how to appear on the field, how to inspect troops, and how to enforce discipline without spectacle. Soldiers did not follow her because she was exceptional. They followed because she was reliable. By the time she emerged as a recognized military figure, the question of her gender had lost relevance. What remained was competence, measured in preparation, execution, and survival. When King Nikotao died, the throne of Zazzau passed to his son Kurama. The succession followed convention, reaffirming male inheritance as the default mechanism of continuity. For many at court, this transfer also settled Amina's future. As a royal woman, her political value was assumed to lie in marriage, alliance, and symbolic stability, rather than command. Kurama did not share this assumption. He had grown alongside Amina and had watched her training evolve from preparation into capability. He understood that Zazzau's strength depended not on preserving custom for its own sake, but on maintaining effective control over force. Removing Amina from the military sphere would have weakened the state at a time when its borders remained contested. Instead of marginalizing her, Kurama elevated her. He entrusted her with command over the cavalry, the most decisive component of Zazzau's army. This was not an honorary position. The cavalry required constant readiness, strict discipline, and strategic coordination across long distances. By placing Amina in this role, Kurama placed her at the center of the kingdom's coercive power. Her responsibilities expanded beyond the battlefield. She served as strategic advisor in matters of defense and expansion, participating in planning rather than merely execution. She also represented Zazzau in military negotiations, interacting with rival states and subordinate territories. These roles exposed her to diplomacy under pressure, where threats and incentives were balanced carefully. Over the next 16 years, Amina consolidated authority through action. Internal revolts were suppressed with speed and precision. Frontier defenses were reinforced, and unreliable units were reorganized or dismantled. Campaigns were conducted not for spectacle, but for stability. Each success reinforced her credibility. Failure did not follow her, and this absence of defeat became its own form of legitimacy. Loyalty accumulated gradually. Soldiers learned that service under Amina meant predictable command, fair distribution of rewards, and survival in the field. Commanders learned that she valued competence over lineage. Her authority did not rest on her title, which remained secondary. It rested on trust earned through repeated performance. During this period, Amina made a final, strategic refusal. She rejected permanent marriage. In a political system where marriage functioned as a mechanism of alliance and control, This decision removed her from manipulation. She would not serve as a conduit for another household's ambitions, nor would her authority be diluted through kinship obligations. By the end of Kurama's reign, Amina no longer required justification. She commanded loyalty without a crown. Power, in her case, preceded legitimacy rather than following it. Kurama's death shattered the balance that had held Zazzau together. Succession was no longer theoretical. It became immediate, contested, and dangerous. Male members of the royal house remained, each supported by factions that invoked tradition as their claim to legitimacy. The throne was vacant, but authority was fragmented. Custom favored men, yet custom alone could not secure the state. Zazzau faced external rivals and internal instability. In this environment, the question was not whether a woman could rule in principle, but whether the kingdom could survive an inexperienced ruler, chosen solely by lineage. Debate inside the court exposed this tension openly. Opponents of Amina framed their resistance in familiar terms. They argued that a woman lacked the physical and psychological capacity to command obedience in war. They warned that rivals would test her rule immediately, interpreting her assent as weakness. These fears were strategic, not moral. They reflected the brutal logic of the era. Supporters responded with evidence rather than ideology. Amina had already commanded armies, suppressed revolts, and defended borders. She had negotiated from strength and maintained discipline over elite cavalry units. Her authority was not speculative. It was operational. The decisive factor was not gender, but the loyalty of those who carried weapons. The army resolved the argument. Cavalry commanders, garrison leaders, and frontier units aligned behind Amina. Their support was coordinated and visible. This alignment signaled to the court that any attempt to bypass her would invite military resistance. No rival was prepared to test that reality. The final argument was simple and brutal. If enemies believed Amina weak, they were free to attack. None did. Silence from rivals confirmed calculation. Power had already chosen. Her coronation was carefully constructed to convert control into legitimacy. Islamic scholars sanctioned her rule, providing religious authority. Elders affirmed continuity with indigenous tradition, signaling stability rather than rupture. Soldiers swore allegiance publicly, transforming private loyalty into collective commitment. Amina was proclaimed Sarki of Zazzau. The title did not create her power. It recognized it. Her ascent did not mark a revolution in governance. Institutions remained intact. Command structures were preserved. Taxes were collected. Trade continued. What changed was visibility. Authority that had operated through competence now operated through sovereignty. Amina did not rule as an exception to the system. She ruled as its most capable product. Her reign began not with spectacle, but with consolidation. Power, once secured, did not need to announce itself. From this moment forward, Zazzau was no longer testing a woman's rule. It was preparing for expansion. Amina did not pause after her coronation to secure comfort or ceremony. She moved immediately to war. Authority, once claimed, had to be demonstrated beyond the capital. The first campaigns of her reign were designed to remove doubt, not to negotiate it away. Her initial target lay to the south, where subordinate territories had begun to resist Zazzau's control. These regions were not distant frontiers, but essential components of the kingdom's economic system. Allowing defiance here would fracture trade routes and invite wider rebellion. Amina assembled a force of roughly 20,000 troops, dominated by cavalry, supported by infantry trained for siege and occupation. The campaign was swift and deliberate. Rather than pursuing annihilation, Amina focused on overwhelming presence. Cities were encircled, supply lines severed, and resistance isolated. Where submission came early, destruction was avoided. Where it did not, force was applied decisively. The objective was not terror alone, but predictability. Resistance would always cost more than compliance. Victory created a new problem. Conquest without control was temporary. Amina understood that armies moved on, but resentment remained. To hold territory after the cavalry withdrew, she introduced a structural solution that transformed her rule. In every major territory brought under Zazzau's authority, she ordered the construction of fortified walls. These were not symbolic boundaries. They were military infrastructure. Built from compacted earth, reinforced and elevated, they encircled cities and strategic points. Gates were controlled. Watchtowers monitored movement. Garrisons enforced order. These walls served multiple purposes simultaneously. They defended against external attack, securing newly acquired territory against rival states. They deterred internal revolt by restricting movement and concentrating surveillance. They also marked possession physically, turning conquest into permanence. Over time, these fortifications became known collectively as the Walls of Amina. Their scale was unprecedented in the region. Some extended for kilometers, enclosing urban centers and trade hubs. They were not temporary works. Many would endure for centuries, surviving long after the political structures that created them had faded. This strategy reflected Amina's understanding of power as infrastructure rather than momentum. Expansion without systems collapses under its own weight. Walls slowed enemies, stabilized borders, and bought time. They allowed Zazzau to govern distance. Military campaigns continued year after year. Amina pushed Zazzau's influence outward, integrating new territories into its administrative and commercial networks. Each conquest followed the same logic: rapid force, enforced submission, structural consolidation. Her armies were feared not because they were uncontrolled, but because they were disciplined. Rival rulers took notice. The message was clear. Zazzau under Amina was no longer reactive. It was expansionist by design. Cities fortified by her order became symbols of inevitability. Resistance delayed conquest, but did not prevent it. These campaigns marked the transformation of Zazzau from a powerful state into an empire. Territory expanded not only in size, but in cohesion. The walls that bore Amina's name were not monuments to vanity. They were instruments of governance. By turning earth into authority, Amina ensured that her conquests would outlast her armies. Conquest was only the first layer of Amina's strategy. Military expansion created space, but commerce turned space into power. Once territory was secured and fortified, Zazzau shifted from a state that fought to a system that extracted, protected, and regulated movement. Trade became the backbone of empire. Zazzau's position made this transformation possible. It sat astride the principal corridors linking the Sahara to the forest zones of the south. Caravans carrying salt moved southward. Gold, cola nuts, ivory, and captives moved northward. Horses, textiles, and manufactured goods circulated east and west. These routes had existed for centuries, but under Amina, they were no longer merely passed through. They were controlled. Security was the first intervention. Amina deployed military escorts along caravan routes, not sporadically, but as policy. Banditry declined. Rival states found it harder to disrupt commerce without provoking direct retaliation. Merchants learned that traveling under Zazzau's protection meant predictable passage and enforceable contracts. Safety became a commodity, and Zazzau sold it. Tribute followed protection. Subordinate territories were required to contribute goods, labor, or revenue, in exchange for military security and access to markets. This system did not erase local authority. It subordinated it. Local rulers remained in place, but their legitimacy now flowed upward. Taxes moved toward Zazzau. Power concentrated at the center. Markets expanded in response. Zazzau's capital became a magnet for traders from across West Africa. Hausa merchants, Tuareg caravan leaders, and intermediaries from the forest regions converged on its markets. Goods were priced, weighed, and regulated. Disputes were adjudicated by Islamic courts whose authority extended beyond ethnicity or clan. Wealth accumulated rapidly. This was not hoarded idly. Revenue funded garrisons, wall maintenance, and cavalry expansion. Trade paid for war, and war secured trade. The system fed itself. Amina understood that commerce required legitimacy as much as force. She cultivated relationships with Islamic scholars who provided legal frameworks for taxation and contracts. Their presence reassured merchants that Zazzau's rules were not arbitrary. Law reduced friction. Predictability increased volume. The empire that emerged was not defined solely by territory. It was defined by flow. Goods moved because Zazzau allowed them to. Wealth accumulated because Zazzau stabilized uncertainty. Rivals who attempted to bypass its routes found themselves isolated or exposed. This commercial dominance altered regional power dynamics. States that had once challenged Zazzau militarily became dependent on its markets. Resistance now carried economic consequences. Amina's empire did not rely on constant campaigning. It relied on structural advantage. Prosperity followed. Urban populations grew. Crafts flourished. Zazzau became richer than at any point in its history. Its influence extended far beyond its walls, shaping decisions in distant courts that never saw its armies but felt its pressure. This was the height of Amina's system. Military force created the empire, but commerce sustained it. Power no longer required constant demonstration. It operated through incentives, dependency, and control of access. Zazzau had become indispensable. By the middle of Amina's reign, Zazzau's dominance had altered the balance of power across Hausaland. Prosperity flowed toward her capital. Trade routes bent around her walls. Tributary rulers obeyed not out of loyalty, but necessity. For neighboring states, accommodation began to feel like suffocation. Resistance did not emerge from a single rival. It emerged as coordination. Kano and Katsina, long-established powers with their own military traditions and commercial interests, recognized the strategic threat Zazzau now posed. Alone, neither could confront Amina directly. Together, they began to assemble a coalition of subordinate rulers, frontier lords, and displaced elites who resented Zazzau's control. The alliance was broad, fragile, and ambitious. Its strength lay in numbers. Estimates placed the coalition's forces between 40 and 50,000 troops, drawn from multiple states and ethnic groups. On paper, the advantage was overwhelming. The strategy was direct confrontation, massed force against a single center of power. Amina did not meet them on those terms. She understood that alliances fail before they collapse on the battlefield. They fail in supply lines, coordination, and morale. The coalition armies were large, but they were slow, dependent on extended logistics, and divided by command rivalries. Amina chose to fight the system, not the soldiers. Her response was asymmetric. Rather than advancing to meet the coalition, she targeted its rear. Cavalry units struck supply routes, destroyed food stores, and disrupted communication between allied commanders. Villages that supported the coalition were isolated rather than destroyed, forcing leaders to divert troops to maintain order at home. She employed scorched earth tactics selectively, denying the enemy access to forage while preserving Zazzau's own supply lines. Psychological pressure followed. Rumors spread deliberately through traders and captives, exaggerating Zazzau's readiness and the disunity within the alliance. Suspicion replaced coordination. The coalition advanced, but slowly. Delays bred frustration. Commanders argued over strategy. Troops began to desert as supplies dwindled. What had been numerical superiority became logistical vulnerability. Amina then executed her most deceptive maneuver. Zazzau's forces appeared to withdraw, abandoning forward positions and leaving the capital seemingly exposed. The coalition interpreted this as weakness. They advanced aggressively, expecting a decisive siege. Instead, they found emptiness. The city's defenses were intact, but its main forces were absent. As the coalition settled into a prolonged encampment, their exhaustion deepened. Supplies ran low, discipline eroded, confidence fractured. At night, Amina struck. Her cavalry returned under cover of darkness, attacking the coalition from multiple directions simultaneously. The assault was coordinated, fast, and relentless. Coalition forces, already strained and disorganized, collapsed under pressure. Command structures disintegrated. Retreat turned into rout. By dawn, the alliance no longer existed. The victory was total. Kano and Katsina survived, but their capacity to challenge Zazzau directly was broken. Subordinate rulers who had joined the coalition were punished or replaced. Others hastened to reaffirm loyalty. The message was unambiguous. Numbers without cohesion meant nothing. This war marked the end of serious resistance to Amina's rule. It demonstrated that her power was not only built on strength, but on strategic intelligence. She did not overpower her enemies. She dismantled them. After this victory, no rival attempted to assemble a comparable coalition. Zazzau's supremacy was no longer contested openly. The region had learned the cost of miscalculation. Amina had secured not just territory, but deterrence. After the collapse of the coalition, Zazzau entered a period of unchallenged dominance. Military threats receded, not because rivals had disappeared, but because the cost of confrontation had become undeniable. Amina no longer needed to fight constantly to maintain authority. Power had reached equilibrium. At its height, Zazzau controlled a territory of roughly 30,000 square kilometers. Its population numbered in the hundreds of thousands, drawn from cities, market towns, and agricultural zones integrated into a single political system. This was not an empire defined by distant tribute alone. It was administratively coherent. Amina governed through indirect rule. Conquered territories retained local leaders, but those leaders were now accountable to Zazzau. Governors oversaw taxation, military obligations, and security, ensuring compliance without the expense of permanent occupation. This approach reduced resistance while maintaining control. Taxation was standardized. Goods moved through regulated markets. Military service was organized through quotas rather than improvisation. Revenue flowed predictably, allowing long-term planning rather than reactive campaigns. Zazzau functioned as a state, not merely a conquering power. Legitimacy was reinforced deliberately. Amina cultivated relationships with Islamic scholars whose authority extended beyond political borders. Their endorsement provided legal justification for taxation, warfare, and governance. Religious institutions stabilized rule by embedding it within widely recognized norms. Trade networks extended northward into North Africa, linking Zazzau indirectly to Mediterranean economies. Merchants carried not only goods, but reputation. Zazzau became known as a place where contracts were enforced, disputes resolved, and violence regulated. This reputation mattered as much as military strength. Internally, order was maintained through predictability. Laws were applied consistently. Punishment was firm but limited. Arbitrary cruelty was avoided, not out of mercy, but out of calculation. Stability increased productivity, and productivity strengthened the state. Amina's authority rested on systems rather than spectacle. She did not rule through constant display or personal indulgence. Her presence was felt through institutions, infrastructure, and policy. The walls she built, the roads she secured, and the markets she regulated carried her authority farther than her voice ever could. At this peak, Zazzau was not merely powerful. It was indispensable. Neighboring states aligned themselves with its interests. Traders planned routes around its protection. Scholars sought patronage within its courts. Influence extended beyond borders without the need for annexation. This phase represented the culmination of Amina's strategic vision. Expansion had slowed, not because ambition had diminished, but because the system no longer required constant growth to sustain itself. Power had become self-reinforcing, yet equilibrium carried its own risks. Empires that rely on a single figure, no matter how competent, eventually confront the limits of endurance. The question was no longer whether Amina could rule effectively. It was whether the system she built could survive her. Even at the height of her authority, Amina did not withdraw entirely from war. Stability did not eliminate threats. It changed their nature. The most serious challenge of her later reign came from Nupe, a rival power to the south whose military culture and resources matched Zazzau more closely than any previous opponent. Nupe was not a fragmented coalition or a subordinate state testing boundaries. It was centralized, experienced, and adaptive. Its territory was defined by rivers, forests, and broken terrain that neutralize cavalry advantage. Unlike many of Zazzau's earlier enemies, Nupe had begun to acquire early European firearms through southern trade routes. These weapons were unreliable, slow to reload, and limited in number, but they altered the psychological balance of the battlefield. Amina approached this conflict with caution. The terrain restricted maneuver. Supply lines were vulnerable. Engagement required sustained presence rather than rapid strikes. Campaigns dragged longer than expected, forcing Zazzau's armies into unfamiliar conditions. For the first time, momentum slowed. During one of these campaigns, Amina narrowly escaped death. Nupe forces executed a coordinated ambush, exploiting terrain and concealment. Zazzau's advance units were struck. Suddenly, and for a brief moment, command collapsed. Amina survived, but the encounter marked a psychological rupture. Invincibility, carefully constructed through decades of success, cracked. The war continued, but its character shifted. Rather than total conquest, Amina recalibrated objectives. She focused on imposing limits rather than domination. Engagements became selective. Attrition replaced decisive battle. Eventually, Zazzau forced Nupe into a negotiated position. Victory came with conditions. Nupe retained internal autonomy in exchange for recognition of Zazzau's supremacy and regulated access to trade. The outcome preserved balance without exhausting resources. Strategically, it was success. Personally, it was warning. After this campaign, Amina began to withdraw from frontline command. She delegated operational control to trusted generals and focused increasingly on administration. This withdrawal was not abdication. It was acknowledgement. Age, risk, and endurance had reached their threshold. The empire did not weaken immediately. Systems remained intact. Borders held. Trade continued. But the tone of rule changed. Expansion ceased. Defense replaced ambition. This period revealed the limits of even the most capable leadership. Amina had built an empire through competence and control, but no individual could remain the central pillar indefinitely. Recognition of that truth marked the final phase of her reign. Power, once extended across vast territory, began to settle into permanence rather than motion. Amina died around the year 1610, after a reign that had reshaped Hausaland for more than 4 decades. Accounts differ on the circumstances. Some traditions place her death during a final campaign. Others suggest she died within the core territories of her empire, surrounded by the institutions she had built. What is consistent across sources is her age. She was elderly by the standards of her time, having ruled well into her later years. Her death created immediate uncertainty. Empires constructed around competence rather than lineage faced their greatest test at succession. Amina had no sons, and her refusal to marry permanently removed obvious heirs from consideration. Authority, once again, had to be negotiated. Rival claimants emerged within the royal house. Governors of distant territories tested boundaries. Tributary states reassessed their obligations. The question was not whether Zazzau would collapse instantly, but whether it would fragment gradually under accumulated pressure. What followed was not chaos. The systems Amina had established proved resilient. Indirect rule allowed local administration to continue functioning despite uncertainty at the center. Tax collection did not cease. Garrisons remained in place. Trade routes stayed open. This continuity prevented immediate disintegration. Nevertheless, Zazzau's expansion ended with her. Without Amina's personal authority, the appetite for further conquest diminished. The state shifted from outward growth to internal preservation. Some subordinate territories regained greater autonomy. Others remained aligned, calculating that stability remained preferable to fragmentation. Succession disputes were managed rather than resolved decisively. No single ruler emerged with Amina's combination of military legitimacy, administrative skill, and personal authority. Power diffused across councils, commanders, and local elites. This diffusion reduced the risk of sudden collapse but limited ambition. The empire began to contract, but slowly. Zazzau did not vanish. It adjusted. Borders softened rather than shattered. Tribute diminished rather than ceased. The walls still stood. Markets still functioned. The system endured, even as momentum faded. This outcome reflected the depth of Amina's institutional legacy. She had not ruled through constant fear or personal charisma alone. She had embedded authority into infrastructure, law, and habit. Those elements outlived her. Her death marked the end of an era, but not the erasure of her work. Zazzau survived because it had learned to operate without her at its center. In historical terms, this was rare. Many empires collapsed with their founders. Zazzau did not. Amina's power, finally, had become structural. The most enduring evidence of Amina's rule was not preserved in chronicles written for distant courts. It was pressed into the earth itself. Across northern Nigeria, massive earthen fortifications still cut through cities and fields, long walls tracing the outlines of former power. Known collectively as the Walls of Amina, these structures remain among the largest pre-colonial defensive works in West Africa. Archaeology confirms their scale. Some extend for many kilometers, enclosing entire urban centers. Their construction required organized labor, technical knowledge, and sustained authority. These were not emergency defenses raised in panic. They were planned infrastructure, built to last, and many of them did. Centuries later, portions of these walls remain standing, mute witnesses to an empire that once organized space with precision. Yet physical evidence alone does not preserve memory. As Zazzau's political power receded, Amina's story shifted from record to oral tradition. In songs, poems, and court narratives, her figure expanded and distorted. She became a warrior of legend, a woman of supernatural strength, a ruler who conquered endlessly and never aged. These embellishments did not honor her. They obscured her. Myth replaced structure. Strategy dissolved into spectacle. Over time, her gender became exaggerated, her sexuality speculated upon, and her political competence reduced to anomaly. In some retellings, her achievements were explained away as masculine traits trapped in a female body. In others, she was framed as an exception so extreme that it could not be replicated or studied. Written history did little to correct this. Early European scholars encountering Hausa traditions filtered them through colonial assumptions. African polities were described as primitive, episodic, or derivative. Female rulers, in particular, were treated as curiosities rather than architects of systems. Amina's empire did not fit European narratives of state formation, and so it was minimized. Even within African historiography, colonial disruption fractured continuity. Administrative records were lost. Oral traditions were dismissed as unreliable. What remained were fragments, stripped of context and coherence. Amina survived as a name, not as a model of governance. Modern scholarship has begun to reverse this process. Hausa chronicles, particularly the Kano Chronicle, provide structured references to Amina's campaigns and authority. Archaeological surveys validate the existence and scale of the walls attributed to her reign. Comparative analysis situates Zazzau within broader Islamic and African state-building traditions. The result is not myth, but reconstruction. What emerges is a ruler neither legendary nor symbolic, but strategic. Amina was not important because she was a woman who ruled. She was important because she built systems that functioned. Her gender explains her erasure, not her significance. History did not forget Amina by accident. It discarded her because her existence disrupted comfortable hierarchies. She ruled without European contact, without colonial mediation, and without fitting inherited categories of power. The recovery of her story is not an act of celebration. It is an act of correction. Amina's legacy endures not in fantasy, but in earthworks, institutions, and the uncomfortable fact that global history has been selectively remembered. Amina's story forces a confrontation with how history has been organized, filtered, and taught. For centuries, global narratives have centered Europe as the default engine of political development, casting other regions as reactive or delayed. Zazzau does not fit that frame. It was neither isolated nor immature. It operated within the same century as European monarchies, Ottoman administrators, and American empires, using parallel tools of power. Recognizing Amina requires dismantling the idea that statecraft followed a single path outward from Europe. Her empire emerged from African conditions, responded to African pressures, and solved African strategic problems. It relied on cavalry rather than ships, earthen walls rather than stone fortresses, and trade corridors rather than oceans. These differences do not imply inferiority. They reflect adaptation. Her rule also challenges assumptions about gender and authority. Amina did not govern by overturning social order or rejecting tradition wholesale. She worked within existing structures and mastered them. Her rise was not symbolic defiance. It was the consequence of competence repeatedly demonstrated in environments that punished weakness without mercy. This distinction matters. Amina was not tolerated. She was relied upon. Her authority was accepted because it produced results. When rivals considered challenging her rule, they measured capacity, not identity. This is not a moral lesson. It is a historical observation about how power actually functions. Infrastructure stands at the center of her legacy. The walls she ordered built were not monuments. They were instruments. They regulated movement, enforced borders, and reduced the cost of control. In modern terms, they represent the principle that durable power is embedded in systems rather than personalities. Amina understood this instinctively. The same logic applied to her commercial policies. Trade did not flourish because she encouraged prosperity as an abstract ideal. It flourished because she reduced risk, enforced contracts, and punished disruption. Markets responded to stability. Wealth followed predictability. These mechanisms are recognizable across history, regardless of continent. Why, then, was this story excluded? The answer lies in narrative control. Colonial scholarship privileged written European sources over African oral and material evidence. Empires without European contact were minimized. Female authority was treated as aberration. What could not be categorized was ignored. Correcting this omission is not about replacing one heroic canon with another. It is about restoring proportionality. Amina belongs in global history not because she represents Africa or women, but because she exercised power at scale in a complex system that endured. Her story exposes the cost of selective memory. When history is narrowed, the range of human capability appears smaller than it is. When figures like Amina are erased, competence itself is misattributed to culture rather than context. Remembering her does not rewrite history. It completes it. So who was Amina of Zazzau? She was not a myth born from exaggeration, nor a symbol constructed after the fact. She was a ruler formed by pressure, trained by systems, and tested by war. Her authority did not emerge from prophecy or exception. It emerged from sustained competence in an environment that rewarded only results. Amina commanded armies because she could. She ruled territory because she knew how to hold it. She built walls not to be remembered, but to make power durable. When expansion threatened to overextend the state, she adjusted. When age imposed limits, she delegated. These were not the actions of a legend. They were the decisions of a strategist. Her empire did not vanish with her death. It contracted, adapted, and endured. That endurance is the clearest measure of her success. Many conquerors leave chaos behind them. Amina left structure. Roads remained secure. Markets continued to function. Governance outlived her presence. This is the difference between domination and statecraft. Yet despite this record, her name slipped from global memory. Not because evidence was absent, but because it was inconvenient. Amina's life disrupts inherited assumptions about where power originates, who wields it, and how it is maintained. She ruled without European contact. She governed without fitting colonial categories. She exercised authority as a woman without reducing it to novelty. History did not forget her by chance. It filtered her out. What remains today are fragments. Walls cutting through modern cities, chronicles preserved unevenly, oral traditions reshaped by time. When assembled carefully, these fragments reveal a coherent picture. Amina was neither anomaly nor exception. She was a product of a sophisticated political world that global history chose not to center. Her story does not demand admiration. It demands recognition. The walls associated with her name will eventually erode. Earth always does. What matters is not their permanence, but what they represent. They demonstrate that power, when embedded in systems, can outlast individuals. They prove that infrastructure is memory made physical. Amina's life also exposes the limits of historical storytelling. When history is framed narrowly, It teaches false lessons. It implies that competence belongs to certain regions, genders, or cultures by default. Amina contradicts that implication simply by existing. She forces a recalibration, not of morality, but of scale. World history was never singular. It was never linear. It was never owned by one continent or one tradition. While European kingdoms consolidated, while Ottoman administrators governed, while American empires rose and fell, Amina built and ruled in parallel, not behind, not beneath, alongside. To restore her to history is not to add a footnote. It is to recover a missing chapter. Amina of Zazzau does not belong to legend. She belongs to the record.